What drives the debates behind the new right in Canada?
It's about a divide between people for whom Canada works, people who benefit from status quo, and people who it doesn't work for, people who see firsthand the effects of what a decade plus terrible decisions and policies have done to this country. I think a lot of the questions around like tone and temperament and that kind of stuff, I think they're actually in some ways luxury beliefs.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Welcome back to Concepts. My name is Sean Watley. Today we have Ben Woodfinden with us. He's a consultant, a doctoral student, a political and constitutional theorist. He's a regular contributor to National Post and The Hub and other media outlets in Canada. He's a fellow with the Research Group on Constitutional Studies at McGill University. He's a senior advisor with Meredith Bosencool and Phillips, and he's a former director of communications for Pierre Poilievre. Needless to say, Ben is a sought-after opinion maker in conservative circles in Canada. If you see an article written by Ben Woodfinden, you need to pick it up, read it. You're going to learn something from it. One of the pieces we talked about for our discussion had to do with whether or not the new conservative fight isn't about red versus blue and whether it's about young versus old. So from there, we got into a deeper discussion about Red Toryism. Those of you who've been following along know that that's been a debate in Canada recently. Ben is probably one of the few Canadian experts on Red Toryism in Canada. Overall, we had a fantastic discussion. It felt like we had to cut it short at the hour mark. I could have certainly gone on for much longer, and I know Ben could have as well. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. We got a little bit more nerdy than usual, a little bit more political philosophy, but a lot of practical discussion as well, trying to understand what's going on in the conservative movement right now and trying to understand how we can leverage some of that energy to improving Canada for the future. So once again, thanks for stopping by. On with the show. Ben Woodfinden, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I appreciate you making the time. My head spins sometimes when I think about how busy you consultants are and writing and speaking. And I wanted to jump into this because you have been at the center, not just of this discussion that's been going on within conservatism in Canada recently, but over the last several years especially. And you have a fairly new piece on Substack, and it's titled, quote, "The New Conservative Fight Isn't Red versus Blue. It's young versus old," end quote. And one sentence in there, you say, "Understanding what's really happening today means forgetting the battle lines of 2003. Explain.
Well, so that piece was, you are right. I confess I'm quite busy these days, and I don't have as much time to write as I wish I had. It's one of my resolutions is to do a bit more writing soon, but that piece was about something that has just been, it's irked me for a long time, but it resurfaces periodically. But in the last kind of couple months, basically since the election, is bubbling up more and more. There's been so many different, there's been so much hand-wringing from a certain class of conservatives, a certain type of conservative about the issues that conservatives focused on at the last election, and the questions around like tone and temperament. And there's a small part of that is the questions around like specific partisan politics. But what that piece is about is kind of broader, what I think are fundamental divides shaping conservatism. They're also shaping our country more broadly. It's not just within conservatism, but these so often there's this tired arguments that get made about this is the nasty populist reform, blue Tories versus the respectable losers. I don't mean losers in like respectable opposition. They never win, but they're respectable in opposition. They're respectable progressive conservatives, and I just think it's just trite. It's just complete. It's not how there are people that still see it that way, but to see it that way is itself a kind of you're outing yourself as being from a certain generation, and the real divide is between I think older and younger. I don't necessarily like the term boomer conservative, but I'll use that as kind of parlance between boomer cons and kind of younger. They call themselves the new right. I don't like that term either, but let's say boomer cons versus the new right, and part of the debate here is. I think it's less about questions around ideology. So it's not about, moderate red Tories versus blue-blooded blue Tories. It's about questions around, it's about a divide between people for whom Canada works, people who benefit from the status quo, and people who it doesn't work for, people who see firsthand the effects of what a decade plus of kind of terrible decisions and policies have done to this country. And whether it's on housing, the fact that young people, they've given up on home ownership, whether it's the decay in our streets, whether it's just cost of living in general, whether it's, the broken immigration system that I think Canadians are sick of and that they've turned against in pretty remarkable fashion. So I think that if you're a conservative of a certain age, these are your animating issues for the most part. Or, if you're a conservative, if you're of a certain age, these are your animating issues. And if you're older, you're at the end of your career, you bought a home, you own a home, or you've nearly paid it off, or you can own it completely. The status quo works pretty well for you. So I think a lot of the questions around like tone and temperament and that kind of stuff, I think they're actually in some ways luxury beliefs where it's easy to be concerned about this kind of stuff when you've got, when you've got not much else to be worried about. If you're worried about paying the bills, now if you can afford a home, I think you probably just care less about this stuff. And also you're probably, I encourage people to go read the piece because I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but you're also like, you are in a certain sense angrier, right? Because I think you're rightly frustrated with the situation that you find yourself in, that the country finds itself in. And I would just, I don't want to like stoke those generational divides, but I also don't think we should pretend that they're not there.
So I'm very frustrated with you, Ben. I had about 10 questions on your piece and you've answered them all in a 3-minute opening. So that was fantastic. That was really, really beautiful. I wanted to pick up though, that one of the challenges speaking with folks like you is that there's a high probability. No, there's a reality that you and I agree on far more than we disagree on. So I have to try to hunt for something to disagree with you on. And so I'm wondering if this is a possible bit of disagreement. You mentioned that there are animating issues, and yet at the start of your remarks, you mentioned fundamental divides. And you're also I believe, a fellow at University of McGill Research Group on Constitutional Studies. So you see the animating issues, the motivations, but yet your whole life, as far as I can tell, exists in this deeper world of ideas and ideologies and concepts and philosophical presuppositions. And so I'm pushing back a tiny bit. I agree with you that there's young versus old. I love that rubric. It's a beautiful way to make sense of this. However, Dr. Woodfinden, or almost Dr. Woodfinden. Almost Dr. Woodfinden, you've done far more work for a PhD thesis than the normal PhD student does. So I'm going to call you your honorary doctor already. You must have a sense that a lot of the discussions are also touching on more fundamental divides. Can you expand on the fundamental divides and not simply the motivation to say, yeah, we don't like that old style conservatism?
Yeah, no, and yeah, to be clear, I think both of these things I don't think they're necessarily in tension. I think about politics, and if politics operates at a few different levels. There is kind of this first principles, this fundamental questions around, politics and philosophy more broadly. I've been thinking about, I was talking about this with my partner yesterday, and because she accuses me of being too gloomy sometimes. And I was saying to her that, no, I actually think my politics, we're talking about something political, and I was saying my politics is, I think, the kind of, my rooted kind of, my philosophical rootedness and what I would build my conservatism around is it's a kind of 50-50 thing, where I think it simultaneously is built around a degree of pessimism, a certain understanding of human nature it is pessimistic to a certain extent. Men are not angels, and we do need things like government to restrain us and provide order and stuff. And there's limits to what we can accomplish and expect in this world. But I also think so. But I also balance that with a kind of I think so. Pessimism and gratitude is the other one, where as you think to be a conservative is to recognize how fragile civilization is and how much of a gift it is, but also be thankful for what we've built, and also it doesn't have to. Again, it's not perfect, but this is where I think that kind of anti-radical kind of impulse in conservatism comes from. So I think I think that's the kind of, not everyone has to agree with me on that. There's lots of different accounts of what it means to be a conservative, but so yeah, I think there are like base instincts, base first principles that matter, and then there's kind of there's the application of those principles to I don't want to use the word ideology, but to a more kind of grounded in actual real world politics philosophy. So it can be an ism of some sort, but that's still fairly abstract. It might be like a broader commitment to say, let's say you have that kind of that pessimism about kind of human nature. It might lead you to be someone that doesn't trust the government to be too powerful. So you might become a kind of limited government conservative kind of thing, because your pessimism about human beings having too much power over each other and what the state does. So that's kind of the middle ground. And then there's the kind of the on the ground level, which is real partisan politics. And I think, and I said this in this piece too, we don't have to spend the whole episode here talking about that the one essay that I wrote, but I do think there's like some of these debates I think come around to kind of questions of kind of materialism in terms of what comes first, economics or culture. And I will admit that in the last few years I've shifted more towards the kind of materialist side of that. I'm not completely there, but I do think this stuff matters. I used to be very much ideas come first. I now think ideas shape economics just as much as economics shapes ideas, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. It's not one. It's not one or the other. It's both. And so I do think that when you're looking at kind of the application of principles and ideas to the real world, you're going to have to take these kinds of factors into consideration. So, conservatism it might have some kind of perennial principles that are associated with it, but it doesn't mean that those principles are always going to look the exact same in the exact same place at the exact same time. I think part of conservatism is actually kind of because there's a realism associated with it, in my view. That realism means that it should look different in different times and different places. And so I think part of what we're seeing in these debates over these divides between young and old, again, blunt way of putting it, but part of that is a question about reapplying basic conservative insights and ideas. And I think again, this is where I'm saying I think economics and culture kind of chicken and egg kind of thing. I think part of the reason young conservatives are kind of thirsty for and see the need for kind of maybe a renewed or kind of reworked conservatism it's not completely different from the kind of conservatism of previous generation, or maybe you want to call it like a Reagan conservatism, as some have been doing in our debates here. But it's reapplying that conservatism to address contemporary challenges and the world we live in now. And I think so. I don't start with the kind of reality of the world and then build my principles out of that. I work both ways. I try to look at the world as it is, but then I also have those principles that kind of exist at the back of my mind. When I was, I think if you ever work in politics, I actually think it's very important to have some sort of, even if your your day-to-day job doesn't feel like there's anything kind of philosophical about it. I do think it's very important to have a kind of grounding in first principles of some sort. That again, even if you're not consciously thinking about them every single day, they still help form you and shape you and help you see the world. They're kind of what the fancy word would be, a heuristic. It's a heuristic tool to help you interpret a chaotic reality.
Yeah. Wow. That's beautiful. As you're talking, I'm continually thinking, oh, maybe I could clip that and maybe I could clip that. That's a beautiful one. So I'm going to ask you a question about realism and anthropology. I won't use those words. I'll explain them when I get there. You know them, but just for the audience. But you mentioned gloominess, and so I had Yuval Levin on the show. He's your author in the States, and I said, Yuval, one of my favorite interviews you did, the host said, "Are you an optimist?" And Yuval said, "I'm not an optimist. I'm a conservative." So he actually starts his last book that way, to say this is a book based on hope, not optimism. And so it ties in with realism. You mentioned that we are honest about what's around us, and then we build from there. We can tie the top down and the bottom up together, but I still am wedded to this idea that ideas matter. I think of John Maynard Keynes's comment, the famous left of center or central controller economist. He said, and I don't know the quote exactly, but he said, men of a free thinking mind are actually more often captives of the ideas of some defunct economist. And that phrase is right, defunct economist. So I think, to your point, that unless we're thinking about the ideas in whatever job we find ourselves in, trying to think about the root principles, they will impact our application of ideas and then our on-the-ground behavior. And so that leads me to my discussion about anthropology. Anthropology is just a $10 word that means, what does it mean to be a human? What is our sense of humans? And so I wonder if you could reflect on or give your thoughts on whether or not we are paying enough attention to what I think is a fundamental divide between liberalism, lots of things I love about liberalism, political liberalism, and philosophical conservatism, or philosophical conservatism and philosophical liberalism. So the liberal position seems to start more from a blank slate. We're a lump of plasticine. You can be whatever you want. Be all you can be. You do you. Oprah Winfrey, you tell your own story. Versus a conservative position seems to start from a more tragic sense of humans, a more Shakespearean sense of humans, that we are capable of great and wonderful things, but we're also capable of some really terrible mistakes. And we have to, if we enter our policy making, so you said application of ideas, and if we enter our on-the-ground politics shaped by one or the other of those two approaches, we will behave and think and write policy very differently. Now, that's my opinion. You're supposed to agree with me now, Dr. Woodfinden, or tell me why that's wrong, or tell me why the conservative movement needs to be thinking more about anthropology. What do we think about humans?
Well, let me offer two different kind of thoughts on this. So let me distinguish between, I'm not saying that they're related, but I have two different kind of thoughts. I think, well, let's come back to the kind of the liberalism versus conservatism question in a second. Within the kind of conservative tent, you have, people that identify as classical liberals. And these are, I would not call myself a classical liberal, but I have a lot of respect for it as a tradition. And I do think we should take it very seriously. This is kind of a liberalism is associated, it's not quite libertarianism, but it's kind of associated with kind of Adam Smith, broadly speaking, a kind of liberty-oriented, limited government kind of, we could spend thinking about this. I think someone listening to this, I'm sure, has a vague idea what it is already, so I won't bore them with details. But, I think there's a lot of compatibility between much of what I would call kind of philosophically grounded conservatism and classical liberalism. They're not the same thing, but I also don't think they're entirely incompatible like some people do. But one big difference between the two of them, I think, is actually this anthropological question. So as I say, my conservatism is rooted in a kind of pessimism about human nature, human ambition, and also just the scope and possibility of what is possible in this world. That doesn't imply anything about what the world after, if there is a world after. It's just that in this life, which we all share, I do think we should have limited ambitions. But I think that pessimism in human nature is it's a pessimism and like I say, a recognition of the fragility of civilization and law. I don't actually know if it was a Scruton, if he coined it, but he's associated with this line that I think about on this, that Good things are not easily created, but they are easily destroyed. And I do think that is a good basic kind of pithy summary of that impulse there. So I think for conservatism, I would say we're much more we are pessimistic about human beings, which means that we need government to provide order. We recognize that there is no freedom without order. That law and liberty go together, but it's also recognition that it's a recognition that humans need to be restrained, and also that states need to be restrained. So it's just a recognition that power in general is needed, but also needs to be restrained. But it's also, I think, a recognition that if human beings need restraints placed on them, it's not just state restraints. There's got to be other restraints too, and that's where kind of conservatives are much more open to kind of social and civic institutions that do place like moral, create norms and conventions. And I was having this discussion with someone the other day about my view is that if you don't have, we were basically having a discussion about shame, stigma and shame, and I'll spare people the details of what we're talking about, but I was basically making the case for some degree of stigma and shame for behavior, and the person I was saying, well, that's not fair on, it's not treating people with respect and stuff. And I was basically just making the point that, look, if you don't want the government to regulate literally everything, we need to have these non-governmental ways to restrain people too. Norms and other ways to regulate human behavior, they are necessary, and they are, we have to be careful with them. They can also be very repressive in a bad way, but they are needed in a society where we're all imperfect people. So again, I've kind of tried to sketch out the kind of broader what I think is where the conservative anthropology there. I think classical liberals also share some of that pessimism, but they tend to be much more kind of optimistic about human beings, and even if they're and much more pessimistic about the state. And so the state needs to be restrained, and when the state is restrained, people will flourish in the absence of a kind of repressive state. And I think there's some truth to that, but I actually think my view on it is it takes a too rosy view on what human beings left to their own devices do. And there's lots of this. Some of them will talk about. Someone like Hayek is very good on this, but like these ideas about things like spontaneous order, and I think that I think there's some truth to this stuff. I'm not discounting it. Like I engage with this stuff very seriously. There are kind of emergent orders. You see these in nature. You also see them in human society, where human beings do organize themselves, and they're able to kind of when left to their own devices, they do create order and structure. But there are limits to that, and it's I'm rambling here, but I do think you can see there are subtle but important differences between classical liberals and conservatives. And then to return to the kind of broader question about liberalism itself. We could spend hours here just debating what liberalism is, so we won't do that. But let me try, and I'm going to both straw man and steel man liberalism here. I think I don't think necessarily liberals are blank statists. Like I think you can be a liberal and recognize that human beings are formed in societies, and they're shaped by the worlds they live in. I think there's lots of liberals that do that. But I think what liberalism will try and do when liberals are doing their first principles, they will try and you think about something like Rawls's Veil of Ignorance, kind of the one of the most famous liberal texts probably. It's a long read if you ever had to read it.
Boring read.
And it's important read. You should read it, but it's not a page turner. And the Veil of Ignorance there is precisely about it's a thought experiment, right? But it's about discarding all this kind of baggage that we come with to try and come to some sort of first principles. So I don't think that I think the unfair characterization of that would be that that's liberals just saying we're just these entirely atomized, blank slate, amorphous beings. I think it's more it's less about saying that that's what human beings are. It's about saying that fundamental principles of justice require us to discard that culture and those customs and those attachments and those traditions, which is where I actually disagree with it. I think it's justice is rooted in some ways in that kind of in the moral traditions that that we're born into, and so I think what liberalism has a tendency to do is because it values the kind of free and autonomous human being, is it can be corrosive to the kind of traditions and institutions that do actually both restrain us but also give us meaning. But I also think it doesn't necessarily. I don't actually think human beings are socially and historically grounded creatures. So it's all well and good to do kind of philosophical experiments where you try and imagine yourself without these, but also you can't imagine yourself without them. You can't escape the fact that a real human being has all this cultural and social baggage attached to them. So it's a flawed thought experiment from the outset, but I do think the kind of to get back to what we were talking about here, the liberal view of a kind of atomized individual, where the only prime autonomy and freedom and self-actualization are the highest kind of moral goals and the highest values that we should be striving towards. I think it's a bit of a straw man, but it's also liberalism left unchecked does tend in that direction. And a lot of the debates around that we're having today, and we've been having for a few years now in other places as well, around kind of is liberalism, is it sustainable? Is it compatible with these other traditions? And my view on this has always been that liberalism, like everything else, emerges in a historical context. It emerges. There's a reason it emerges basically in kind of Protestant Europe, and doesn't mean only Protestant Europeans can be liberals, but it emerges out of a certain historical context, and liberalism in many ways it coexisted with, and also depends on lots of kind of pre-liberal traditions, whether it's, again, civic institutions, religious institutions. And I think a liberal society is one in which the liberals can recognize, and I do think plenty of liberals actually do recognize this, but and we're, again, to be clear, we're talking about small L liberals here, not big L liberals, but a liberalism that kind of recognizes that there's liberalism is a kind of limited philosophy, and it's not I've got a book on my shelf actually behind me here called, and it's actually quite interesting, I recommend it. It's called Liberalism as a Way of Life. So it's a kind of comprehensive, it's an attempt to comprehensively sketch out, it's an attempt to sketch out a kind of comprehensive doctrine of liberalism in all of your life. And
was that Cecil or is that Minot? Or
no, it's a brand new book. It's by a guy called Alexandre Lafayette. So
Lafayette.
I think he's an academic at Princeton. Right. The book is actually, it's a very interesting book. I recommend it. I just finished it, but I think a limited liberalism that recognizes the limits of its own, what is possible and what it should do. I think that's perfectly. Again, we could have these debates for hours, but I'm trying to steelman liberalism here. I don't want to just kind of dismiss it all as this kind of atomic acid that just eats away and dissolves everything. But liberalism is built on a slightly different understanding of the human person, I think, than philosophical conservatism.
Yeah. No, that was a great answer. And don't ever apologize for rambling. Rambling is the point of a podcast. We one of my colleagues in the past, she called it knowledge generating dialogue. This was long before podcasts existed, but it's through talking. Call it a Socratic approach if you want. It's through talking and questioning and putting an idea out in front of ourselves and then saying, yeah, but that's not really the idea, and offering nuance and caveats. So yeah, no, this is brilliant. This is why we're paying you.
I spent too many years doing communications work where the key was to be as precise and as efficient as possible. What you're saying, so.
Yeah, no, that ruins knowledge. So, a couple thoughts. Very few people have a coherent philosophy, and I think you've highlighted that most people, even if they call themselves a liberal, classical liberal, or some other kind of liberal, they'll have elements of historical roots, community attachments, whatever. And I think actually you work with Ken Bosenkohl, and he says, in the home, I'm a socialist. In my community, I'm a communitarian. And, at municipal level, and he talks about different levels of organization will have us present a different kind of philosophy. But I wanted to try to link what you just said and pivot over to your work on Red Toryism, because you really have done a lot of thinking and writing on that. And if we can link in what you just said about anthropology, I had Ron Dart on here, who is written extensively on Toryism, specifically high Toryism. And I asked him a similar question about human nature, and he said, oh, yeah, no, this is really the central question. He said, Aristotle talks about us being an acorn, and we all have potential, but there are limits to that potential. We're still going to end up being an oak tree. We might be a different shaped oak tree. And he tried to use that as a differentiating feature between a blank slate, anything is possible approach versus a more constrained anthropology. Having said that, and I said this to Ron, I had a great talk with him. I said, Ron, gosh, some of your book, it sounds like you're a full-blown, socialist. So you've made comments about at least the traditional, some strains within, I will say for sure within a European conservatism, that places high regard on the state. And I think even Edmund Burke said he looked on the state as being a gift from Providence. God gave us the state so that we don't kill each other. I'm not sure if Hobbes said that as well. But anyway, so high regard for the state. And yet in the North American context, we've said, no, we actually moved here to get away from nasty states. And then within all of that, we have Toryism and Red Toryism. And you've thought about that. In your last article, you said it was a remnant. In an article earlier for C2C Journal, which I'll put a link out for, you really went in depth on Toryism and Red Toryism. So I'm wondering if you could just share your thoughts on that. A, what is it? B, is it relevant at all in Canada? And what should we know about it today?
Yeah, I'll say as well, if we can include it in the show notes as well, it's a very expensive academic book, but I have a chapter in a book that came out about a year ago on, I think the book's called Reading George Grant in the 21st Century, and it's probably my most extensive kind of elaboration of the Red Tory tradition. But that C2C piece as well. It's funny. I've given up the battle for the label. I wish I could kind of, I wish I could claim like a copyright on it, and then I could fine people every time they misuse it. But sadly, that's not how it works in the world of ideas. Where I've kind of given up on the label itself because I think it's been hopelessly ruined just by the way it gets used now. Because if you hear it used in common parlance today, a Red Tory is a kind of basically a squishy kind of conservative, right? They're liberal light. The moniker often gets is the kind of the socially liberal, fiscally conservative. So they're just liberals that want slightly lower taxes, progressives that want lower taxes, and even then they don't want lower taxes. It's a cocktail party trick. Now that's not what the actual tradition of Red Toryism is the polar opposite of this, and it's my interest in it when I really became one of the reasons I kind of became, I won't say I'm an expert in it, but I'm definitely someone that's probably fairly well read on it and has written about it, and it's because it's a genuinely, distinctly Canadian conservative tradition. So the term was coined by a political scientist called Gad Horowitz I think it was in the 60s, 50s or 60s, to describe people like George Grant and a few others Grant himself hated the term and refused to use it, but Grant also was just a grumpy, pessimistic guy in many ways, so of course he did. But the term itself it's actually meant to describe the red part of it is not liberal, like it's not liberal red, it's socialist red, and think of it as if we think about, again, this is a gross simplification, but the Americans are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, much more kind of classically liberal kind of society. Canada is peace, order, and good government, and it's much more Tory in some sense. There's again, they're not polar opposites, but they are different. And British North America that becomes Canada eventually after Confederation. It exists in some way. It has always existed because we did not want to be like those free-ranging Republicans down south, right? That is part of our political culture. And people try and dismiss this now. It still undoubtedly, in my mind, exists in our culture. We do have a more, let's call it kind of communitarian spirit in Canada. And I think that it's partially prone to geography and the fact that it's so cold here that it's harder to be as individualist here. But I do think there's a political culture, there's a big difference in political culture too, that are rooted in this kind of Tory loyalist kind of tradition. And but that Red Toryism. So if you think of Canada as a country that was built to be more, still a free society, but a more restrained society, one where there is more, peace, order, and good government. Well, that implies kind of a more maybe not optimistic view of the state, but a more openness to see the state as a necessary part of a free society, an ordered society. And we'd live next door to this superpower that could gobble us up at any moment in many ways, right? So, and not just I don't just mean in terms of kind of like, like march in here with troops and take over. Culturally, it could gobble us up at any moment. And economically, it could gobble us up at any moment. And so part of the Canadian project, if you want to call it that, has always been, how do we find ways to preserve our distinctiveness and some degree of sovereignty in the fact that we share this ginormous border with what happens to be the world's largest superpower, most important superpower. So the necessity, what that did to the kind of Tory, so that I think that is a kind of Tory impulse there. It's about preserving your own traditions, your own customs. But I think there's a recognition in Canada, because of our geography, because of our size, there's going to have to be an active role for the state to a certain extent in doing that, to preserve our distinctiveness and to also just preserve our sovereignty. So this Red Tory tradition that combines a kind of, it's not socialism, but it's a statist philosophy with a kind of Tory impulse and Tory ends. That is Red Toryism in a nutshell. And it's a tradition that is distinctly Canadian because it arose in a distinctly Canadian context to deal with our unique situation. Right? No other country shares a ball. No other country sits in the same position as Canada does vis-a-vis the United States. So it's a distinctly Canadian tradition. It's played an important role in our, like, there's plenty of, like, Sir John A. is, I think, could be considered a Red Tory. He's and doesn't mean he was a Squish. It means he was committed. Things like railway projects and stuff like that. Right? He was very much committed to. He saw that as a nation-building project, and there was a heavy degree of state involvement in that. Think about things like the CBC was actually created by a conservative, right? And it was by a progressive conservative, and it was actually about preserving, again, like making sure that we didn't just have American news and radio on our airwaves. And there's imperfect ways to do that. It's funny how we've been having these debates for 100 years, and the latest version of it is questions about like streaming rules and the internet and stuff. And these are just kind of perennial debates around preserving our culture and stuff like that. They'll never go away. But then there's other institutions too. And some of them are just, like the hydro companies, things like that. There's all sorts of other examples we could give. But I think Canadian conservatism has, until probably 30 years ago, was much more comfortable with recognizing a necessary role. It wasn't statist, but it recognized a much more necessary role for the state in Canadian society. And again, it was a contra. We now see the conservatives now get kind of typecast as though we're just all wannabe Americans, but historically it was actually the liberals that were the much more like friendly to integration with the United States, and the changes in the 80s basically. But so I think that is the kind of the roots of Red Toryism. So it's a much more pro-state interventionism at times for much more kind of socially and culturally conservative ends. So it's literally it's instead of it being the moniker is the socially progressive, economically, fiscally conservative. It's actually fiscally more statist, or economically more statist, and socially and culturally more conservative. So it's literally the kind of polar opposite of that in some ways. And I've lost the battle for the term. We're never going to reclaim it. And I think there are still people that fit that description in this country. And I actually think that the kind of much more the most underrated, if you think about politics in that kind of four-way, in those quadrants, those kind of economically left, I will just use left and right, it's not perfect, but those more economically left-wing, culturally, socially right-wing, they're actually they are not represented well in media or like elite institutions, but there's a lot more of them out there than people realize. And I do think they're kind of don't sleep on them as kind of the people that you can, people that have distinct politics from what we're traditionally told, which is when, you have to be pro-free markets and socially conservative, when you have to be pro-state intervention and socially progressive. There are other ways to think about politics. It's a very fascinating way to think about it when you think about it that way. But so that tradition is, I think it's worth taking seriously and preserving it and learning from it. I don't know if I would use the term to describe myself anymore, but I'm still very much influenced by it and take it very seriously. And as I said before, the kind of the philosopher that's most closely associated with it is a guy named George Grant, who I'm sure has come up on this show more than once.
Yeah.
And I think Grant is probably one of the most interesting thinkers of the last 100 years. And I joke with people that I wish I'd actually done my dissertation on Grant instead of what I'm doing now, because I kind of fell in love with him by accident. But his worldview transcends. He's not really. He's most well known for his Lament for a Nation, which gets into these kinds of questions. But his other work is much more philosophical. It's questions about technology, modernity, liberalism, things like that.
So loving this, and it'd be fun actually to have you and Ron Dart maybe talk together sometime. So I'll ask you a similar question that I did to Ron. I found Lament for a Nation, I found it frustrating first time I read it. I thought, oh man, this guy, just like you said, he's basically a liberal, or he's a communist liberal. It just was frustrating. And I only really understood it after I started reading George Grant's collected works, and especially his volume 3. And I couldn't help, and I love what he's saying in there. He's saying, watch out for the universal and homogeneous state. He said, this is what's going to happen. Technocracy is going to take over. You have to be careful of this. And so on the one hand, you read Lament and you think, oh, this guy's a statist. He's pro-state. But then you read his collected works and he's much more nuanced, as you just said. And so my question for you is, given the nuance that we find in Grant and the fact that the state in the 1960s was a fraction of the size that it is today, do you think perhaps that Grant would take a different tone today about the gigantic spending he sees now, because he was already warning about the universal and homogeneous state back in the 1960s? And then building on that, one of my favorite essays is at the beginning of his Technology and Empire. The first chapter of that book is a defense of North America. And he said, if you really want to understand North America, it's a bunch of people who come here, and to your point about geography, they have to survive. And so they need to be able to control nature. So they align with the anti-Aristotelian scientists who say, no, just tell us about how to shoot the bear. We don't want to care about why the bear exists or what's the purpose of the bear. So very, very practical. Mm-hmm. And then also their religion was a Protestant. It was a Calvinism, where they said, no, we don't want to know about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. We just want people to get saved and be practical and then, go defend our frontier. So that mindset works well in a settler colony or a developing state. Now, when we have urbanization, knowledge economy, we're existing in a world where we don't have the roots that they have in Europe. We don't have a background of culture. And so the Red Tory, or even the broader Tory ethos of, hanging on to a culture, well, there really wasn't much culture on the prairies. even when I was growing up in the 1970s, there wasn't a real, you were on your own. The government wasn't there. You could not wait for the government to come and help you. So given the fact that Grant was writing when the state was much smaller, that Grant warned about the universal and homogeneous state, and that Grant also noted that he called it the primal spirit of Canadians were bent towards this very pragmatic fight against nature and go to church on Sunday. And it was very limited. So given all that, I'm wondering, I know it's impossible for you to know, and so this gives you a lot of room to say whatever you want, but do you think Grant maybe wouldn't be the statist that many people make him out to be if he were writing today?
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to say no. I think he would still be kind of who he is. And let me back up on to explain why I think that. So this is that other chapter that I'll send you the link and include in the show notes. This is where I kind of elucidate this. So, the universal, this idea of the universal and homogeneous state comes from, it's made famous by, Grant actually engages in these debates with Strauss and with Kojève, but wrote a very interesting essay called Tyranny and Wisdom, I think it's called. It's been a few years since I've read it, but where he directly gets involved in these debates. But the UHS is this, the way to think about it is not just this kind of literal kind of global one world government. It's a world in which, if we recognize, it's a world in which kind of liberalism, kind of Hegelian liberalism is fully actualized. And it's one where, we're all universally equal, and we have equal recognition, but it's, part of what that does is it dissolves all kind of particularities, because that makes us different. So it's a world in which we're kind of all equal and all the same. So that's the homogeneous side of it. So in theory, you could have different states existing under this, but they'd all be fundamentally of the same. Think of the UH as kind of like a regime as opposed to a specific country or state. And so the argument that people like Strauss and Grant to a certain extent makes is that this would be a tyrannical to a certain extent, because it would be one that actually does not allow for kind of human excellence, human flourishing. And that's more Strauss's argument. I'm simplifying these things mentally, but that's Strauss's argument. And Kojève, the guy who comes up with this, who is another just fascinating figure, one of the most interesting people. And I'm reading a biography about him right now that I'm learning a lot about him I didn't know. But Kojève is this fascinating figure who he's Russian born. There's been speculation about whether he was a spy for the Soviet Union or not. But he was a professor at university, and he comes from basically like a Russian noble family. They flee after the revolution. Long story short, ends up in France, ends up in Paris. He's a prof at university there, and he teaches these classes on Hegel. That like the number of kind of French intellectuals that took his classes, it's basically every important French philosopher for like a 30-year period takes his classes and they take it in all sorts of different directions. But the lectures they're collected in this very, very dense, again, hard to read book called The Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. And it's built on this kind of, he basically focuses in on basically 2 pages in the entire Phenomenology of Spirit, which is this ginormous tome. And it's basically this idea of like the master-slave dialectic, and that history is driven by the master who is willing to die to be distinct and to be recognized, the slave who is not. Anyway, eventually the slave overthrowing the master, and that's the dialectic of history. So we don't need to go into that. We could. I would love to go into that.
You can go as deep as you want. I love talking about Hegel because I can't understand him at all, but his name comes up all the time.
Yeah. But this is where these debates around the UHS come from, and I think Grant's kind of, I'll get it back to Grant here. So this UHS it's this world where particularities are dissolved. We're all equal. We're all the same. And it's a miserable world in some ways because there's no distinctiveness anymore. There's endless diversity, but not distinctiveness in some ways. I think it's probably the way it would look if it was ever fully came to fruition. And Grant's the other version of Grant's kind of conservatism or Toryism, if you can call it that, is this more philosophical impulse that he refers to as kind of love of one's own. It's similar to kind of Scrutinus's idea of kind of oikophilia, this like love of home. But for Grant, Grant was he was an Anglican, I think, but he was a very religious man, and that kind of his Christianity animates it's often in the background, but it does animate his writing and his thinking. And for Grant, he makes this his kind of defense against, let's call it that kind of the UHS, is kind of homogenizing, universalizing political instincts and ideologies and forces. For Grant, the kind of love of one's own, so your family, your town, your province, your city, your country, these are not kind of capital L loves or big T truths. They are particular manifestations of love and care and in the world that we live in. And for Grant, the kind of what we learn in these, again, I increasingly don't like the word community because I think it's been hijacked by the left to mean silly things. But these groups, these communities that we build ourselves into, they point us to something transcendent. They point us to a higher love, and they actually teach us how to love and how to care and how to have these kind of basic virtues that eventually point us to that they are not the end in themselves. They are end to something else, something higher. And so for Grant, the kind of the beauty of the parts of the reason we need to preserve our kind of particularities in the world is precisely because they point to something. They cultivate virtues in us that point to something higher. And you don't have to agree with that or not, but I do think this kind of love of one's own, the kind of oikophilia, as Scruton calls it, love of one's own, as Grant calls it, I do think this is another kind of basic. It's part of that gratitude I was talking about earlier. We are shaped by the places we come from, and we do learn. We are historically, socially, culturally grounded and embedded creatures. We cannot escape that, and we shouldn't try and escape it either. It's silly to try and escape it. We actually the things that give our life meaning, the things that give us purpose, the things that make our life coherent, they come from these kind of particularities. Doesn't mean those particularities are kind of capital P, capital T truths themselves, but they do give us these values and this ability to, I think, experience the world in meaningful ways and ground us. And so I think what Grant actually, I think he would resist, to answer your question, I think he would resist, I think he would have some skepticism about the kind of lots of things about modern life, modern governments and modern regimes, but I also think he would probably be, I don't think he'd be willing to throw everything out in the process. He actually did write towards the end of his life, he basically writing, I'm blanking on the name, I'll have to go look it up, but an essay about kind of, it was when he was at his most pessimistic about kind of things to do with like abortion and the war in Vietnam, things that he was very morally opposed to. And he basically asks himself the question of how could he be loyal to a regime that he considers fundamentally evil in some sense. And I do think in that book the Reading George Grant, there's a very good essay by a friend of mine, a guy called Ryan McKinnell, who he basically takes Grant to task for kind of saying that the Soviet Union and the United States were morally no different, and I think he's right about that, and Grant does take that too far. But Grant is not beyond, he deserves to be criticized. Everyone does. Thought deserves to be engaged with critically, but Grant was asking himself these questions about kind of loyalty to regimes that he had moral conflicts on. But I think that love of one's own is not necessarily it's not just about the government. And this is as I was saying earlier, this is why it's so important that we have why things like social norms and whether it's, I'll just call them social norms and rules in general, are so important. Social, cultural, moral norms are so important because they're actually, we need those restraints, and we're actually, our lives are ordered and given meaning by them, and it helps us go about our way in the world. And if we don't have them, in the absence of those things, you don't just have kind of, completely autonomous, fully functioning, autonomous, rational agents that just make rational, self-interested choices or anything like that. You have chaos, and what happens in response to that is the state steps in, and as those rules recede, more state regulation comes in its place usually, because we have to regulate our behavior in some ways. So, and regulate society. So, I think Grant would be. Grant was certainly not kind of a state worshipper and a statist, but I think he recognizes the necessity of the state and the kind of unique context that we find ourselves. So that's, I don't think I answered your question there, but
No,
I'm trying to do my best impression of Grant. So
no, that was a good ramble, and that's what we're after. So that's perfect. That's beautiful. I wish we had time to talk about the universal in particular. This is one of my favorite topics that I like to wrestle with people about, so I can learn more about it. I still think it's a very live and relevant issue in modern politics, but we're coming to the bottom of the hour. I know you have a hard stop. I have a hard stop. I like to ask people, what do you think we should be thinking about? What's keeping you awake at night? What are we missing in our discussions right now in the broader conservative community?
I think something I've been thinking about a lot in the last just week or so. So I was, I'd spend half my week in Toronto, half my week in Ottawa these days with work and other obligations. So, but I live in Ottawa, and I was lucky enough last week, Russ Douthat was here, the New York Times columnist and author and thinker. And he gave us very interesting, I'll keep it brief, but he gave a very interesting talk. And he has a new book, which I confess I've not actually read yet, but he has this new book on belief, and I think it's called, like, the subtitles, like, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, something like that. But the point he made in this talk that I've been musing on ever since, and I think is a very important point for Canadians to be thinking about, is as we live in this world where political ideologies, technologies kind of seem to be dissolving every kind of frontier and boundary and rule and everything, just like a universal acid that's dissolving everything. It's going to destabilize human beings, especially because we are not used to being these kind of unmoored creatures, and it has quite devastating consequences for individuals when we are. The argument that Douthat made, which I'm going to write about at some point, is that he's actually quite bullish on kind of things like religion and other kind of like coherent belief systems, if you can call them that, and their ability to kind of survive. We used to think that the secularization thesis was that the conventional wisdom is that religion was going to just die out, but does seem to be some evidence that actually that religion isn't. We're not all going back to church again, but it does seem to have the bleeding does seem to have stopped, and younger people especially do seem to be kind of becoming more. There does seem to be some signs, especially young men, are going back to church in insignificant numbers. So, but his broader argument is that the institutions, and whether it's countries, whether it's other institutions, the ones that will be able to survive in this increasingly fluid and unstable world are ones that have kind of belief, ones that have some sort of coherent value proposition that kind of gives them purpose, gives them meaning, roots them, and also gives them a kind of drive to do things. So it's not that you shouldn't just be religious because of kind of utilitarian reasons. It's a silly reason to be religious, but I do think there's some sort of interesting case test there. I think he's right about that. It actually made me, I don't know if it made me think of Dune, the Dune series, where like it's set thousands and thousands of years in the future, and but the like religion in various hard belief systems that survive, and the most kind of powerful forces in the universe tend to be these ones that have this kind of coherent thing that gives them a reason to exist and perpetuate themselves.
Yeah. And
so I think we should be thinking about that in the Canadian context. Where are we a country that believes in itself in enough that, we've had this elbows up moment where we've all of a sudden decided we're not ashamed of Canada anymore. We're proud to be Canadian again. But I don't know how much thinking we've actually done in kind of a serious way about what it means to be Canadian. What about us makes us distinct? What is going to help us in this 100 years from now? What is it about us that's going to mean that we endure and that we survive? And so yeah, that keeps me up at night. I think in many ways that this country is, I'm very proud to be Canadian. I consider myself a Canadian patriot, but I also I find myself asking these questions about what actually holds us together. What is there to hold us together? That if we want to survive, which I do, some basic instinct in me wants us to survive and wants us to endure, we need to think seriously about this stuff and figure out what do we believe in when we say we're Canadian. What are we believing in there? What gives us that belief that will allow us to perpetuate ourselves?
Yeah, that's a brilliant note to end on. It's one of the things that I've been asking a lot of people too. What's the basis of our stickiness? Ben Woodfinden, it's a real pleasure to have you here. We'll have links to your 2 articles, links to your chapter in that book. I think I'm going to have to go for that Grant book. It's been recommended a few times. But if those in the audience, if ever you see an article written by Ben, it's really a must read. You have to read it. He's pouring in a ton of research and thought and just a very clear thinker. It's been a pleasure having you here today, sir. Thanks again.